The CIA was created because the State Department wanted dirty deeds done without being attributed to the State Department. So they needed some outside agency which could do what George Kennan called 2 months before he authored the plausible deniability doctrine in NSC 10-2. He called this the inauguration of organized political warfare. This is a very little known memo that was not declassified, I believe, until 2005. It was written in 1948. Everyone knows George Kennan as the head of the policy planning staff at the State Department, as the author of the containment strategy against Russia in the Cold War, one of the most celebrated folks in U.S. diplomacy history. But 2 months before granting this license to do all this, to have the CIA operate through NGOs, through civil society organizations, through private foundations, through these astroturfed grassroots advocacy nonprofits, he wrote this memo called the Inauguration of Organized Political Warfare. And he argues that this is now April 1948. We had just effectively rigged the 1948 Italian election, April 18th, 1948. We had wanted, this was the first democratic election in Italy, which after World War II had ended. And we had, it pitted basically a pro-U.S., pro-Western democracy candidate versus a pro-Soviet autocracy candidate was how it was pitched. And the very first national security memo, 1-1, was on the central importance of Italy to the U.S. position at the dawn of the Cold War, and that we could not afford to lose this election. And so the very first covert action of the Central Intelligence Agency, because under the 1947 Act, it was largely conceived of as being an intelligence collection agency, not so much operations. The CIA has two different career tracks.
Right.
Intelligence, they call it the analyst track and the operations track. And they're very different breeds of people. They're very, very different in what they do. One of them, you collect the intelligence and you synthesize it for policymakers at the State Department or at the White House National Security Council.
A lot of reading, a lot of foreign websites.
Yes, a lot of academics.
Yeah.
And the operations is where you get, the Barry Seal, cocaine cowboy types, and these, the kind of wild folks who go in and do the dirty work to overthrow democratically elected governments or to do the.
So when people talk about the CIA, they're talking about the director of operations, really.
Yeah,
that's what people in the popular imagination. That's what a CIA officer is.
True, although John Brennan was an analyst track his whole career, and I don't know that makes a more charitable case than the operations side, but the fact is Kennan writes this memo in 1948, 12 days after the U.S. had rigged the Italian election in 1948, and that's what it was. Miles Copeland, who was one of the leaders of that from the CIA side, wrote in a biography later in his life that without CIA intervention in that election, we would have lost 60-40.
I believe his son went on to play the drums in the Police, Stuart Copeland.
Well, and Miles Copeland,
I think I may be getting that wrong.
The grandson actually went on to be, I think, the manager for Sting, REM, a bunch of these major bands, and then teamed up with Donald Rumsfeld in order to help do music diplomacy in Iraq and Afghanistan, which is a whole other, it's a family of secrets. What happens is in the 1948 election, the CIA, which did not really have the authorization to do what it did, it was a last-minute, last-ditch Hail Mary effort to swing the election, and they took the assets that they had from World War II, backing, at that time, the OSS, the War Department, before it in 1948 it changed to the Defense Department. The War Department had worked closely with the Vatican, with the Church, as well as with mafia organizations, organized crime factions in Italy that were being prosecuted by Mussolini. And we were teamed up with them. They gave us access to ports, to infrastructure, to safe houses. They were a big network, pro-U.S. network node during the during World War II. And because of their influence on unions, they allowed us to run arms, run transshipments of supplies, food, assistance, all of that, which is one of the reasons that the Italian mafia was protected for 60 years. It was very much a Cold War asset for the U.S. But so the CIA achieves this successful result in April 1948, and they do so by using NGOs. They use charity fronts. They use philanthropic foundations to funnel money and assistance in. They work through the unions and the trade labor associations, which are civil society organizations that you can consider in the NGO fold. They work through all of these charities, foundations, nonprofits, the NGO sphere, in order to run this election rigging in 1948. So 12 days later, George Kennan writes a memo from the U.S. State Department called The Inauguration of Organized Political Warfare. And everyone can look this up online. And he lays out how this is the model blueprint for the American power in the 20th century, and that we need to overcome the basic distinction between peace and war that Americans have long believed there was, because the average American does not understand the intricacies of international relations. And if we don't seize this initiative to build an organized political warfare apparatus through this State Department intelligence function, then we will lose the American century. We'll lose the 20th century to the Bolsheviks or to the British, who each have their own Department of Dirty Tricks. And so it goes on to say that this is a State Department function. Ideally, it would be within a State Department Bureau of Political Warfare. So I think what the Director of Political Warfare is what they wanted to call this until they decided. And in the memo, he says that, but there are problems with this, which is that because the State Department provides a public audit of its funds, we would not be able to conceal these funds in the State Department budget. So it might be ideal to have an outside intelligence agency to take on this function. And that's why 2 months later, the CIA was given the plausible deniability doctrine and delegated these powers by that very author, George Kennan. But at the back of this memo are fascinating exhibits of contemplated ways to structure recommendations and proposals for structuring this CIA intelligence work through NGOs. And it includes creating, for example, voluntary councils of an outside organization that would nominally look to the public like it was a grassroots organization that is helmed by fine, upstanding members of the American establishment or people in great repute. He actually uses the line, members of the American business community of the caliber of Allen Dulles. Of course, Allen Dulles was the CIA chief, but they would...
A true criminal.
Right. And, at the time his brother was running the State Department. But, and it goes on to say that it would look to the world like it's an NGO, but it would receive funding from the CIA. It would receive guidance from the CIA, and it would constantly coordinate. And it was at that very year that the term NGO really became a codified term when the term non-governmental organization was entered into the charter of the UN Declaration on Human Rights in 1948, where the Economic and Social Council was directed to coordinate everything it did with NGOs. And that's really the sort of etymology of that term in terms of its explosion, is when the UN codified that term. And that's what essentially set off this NGO arms race, this proliferation of cells within American statecraft, the American business community, within the American intelligence community, the national security community, to each create their own cellular circuitry in order to advance their interests. And I can get sort of deeper into that story. If you'd like, I can just take it from history there to present. But I'd feel remiss if I didn't also note that there's a government and there's a business side of it. And the thing that I think a lot of people are missing in this story and the attempt to take on the rogue elements of the NGOplex is that last time we talked, it was right after USAID had been announced its closure. And I took what a lot of people, I think, thought was a somber tone on that I was celebrating its shutdown, but I was braced for impact about the ramifications of this and how it might play out. And I think I used the term that, this is necessary to do this open heart surgery. We also have to ensure that the patient doesn't die on the operating table. Just because it's the right diagnosis doesn't mean, you can set it and forget it. If you don't midwife the process diligently, you could kill the entire American empire. And I bring up that point here because it's not just American intelligence and American statecraft and, the State Department, the DOD, the CIA. It's also virtually every single major international corporation that we consider to be American that is wrapped up in this NGO plex.